and thank you for joining us here today at Fair Talk by Fair Farms. My name's Amanda Higgins. Today I'm excited to be joined by our special guest speaker, Mr. Ben Rogers from National Farmers Federation. He's the General Manager of Workplace Relations and Legal Affairs. Ben, welcome.
G'day Amanda, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for taking time out of your day to come and join us.
My pleasure.
Ben, you've been with the NFF since 2017. Prior to this, you worked as a solicitor with government, in federal government, and in private practice. So I think that you've got a wide range of experience to talk us through some of these policy changes that we see today.
I do, thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. One of the things I'd like to discuss is your recent submission on the food chain supply capacity study. Can you provide a little bit of a general overview as to what that submission and report was about, why it was commissioned, and what potentially some of those findings might look like?
Yeah. So the name sort of says it all, but it's missing an important word, which is labour. So it's the food supply chain workforce capacity study. And it is what it sounds like. So it's a study of the food supply chain labour needs, the way we use labour, the sources of labour, the way labour evolves, the way we can develop labour, what our future needs might look like. So it's looking at things like attraction and retention, it's looking at resilience within the labour market, it's looking at skills development, it's looking at the various, as I say, sources of labour. So migration is an important part of the study, which I'm sure we'll come to. And it's also looking at some of the stuff which informs decision making, like, for example, the data that's out there and available to the government and industry bodies to, make submissions about what we need.
Yeah. So it looks at it not just from planting and harvesting, it looks at the food supply chain all the way through every industry or hands it touches in the way of transport, warehousing, retailing?
Retailing, manufacturing. So it is the entirety of the food supply chain. And it's not just horticulture, obviously, it's all of agriculture as well. So everything behind the farm gate and post-farm gate in that food supply chain.
Yeah, great. And who was the organisation that actually conducted the study?
So it's still ongoing right now, but it's being done by Jobs and Skills Australia, which is a new government agency. It was established back in 2022 to really look holistically at labour supply, workforce needs, workforce development within the country as a whole.
Yeah, sure. And from your submission on behalf of NFF and your contribution to that study, what do you think is the potential consensus that might be coming out when that report's published? I know it hasn't been done yet, but we are expecting any day now their final report to be released. Yeah,
so I mean, it's going to look at, as I say, a whole bunch of different things, and I think they're going to look at skills development's an important part of this, right? And how we can attract new people to the sector, and what sort of things we can do to promote jobs within the sector. What sort of things will draw people to the sector? What sort of roles they're looking for, and what they're looking for a job. It'll look at the workforce needs, and it's going to have to acknowledge shortages that we face in the skilled and unskilled labour forces. Labour markets, and it's going to look at migration pretty heavily, which is obviously an important source of labour for the sector.
Yeah, and so if that's acknowledging that we've got skill shortages right now, and sort of saying, well, what can we do now to future-proof our industries, because it's not a short-term solution, is there? I don't imagine that we've got some stopgaps other than potential migration and backpackers, and we'll discuss what the implications on that might look like in a little bit. But that feeds into the migration review you were saying.
Exactly right, yeah.
Can you explain a bit what's happening in that space, please?
Yeah, so when Labor took office back in 2022, they made a commitment to look at the migration system as a whole. So that process really started with a series of reviews which reported back to the government in the middle of last year. So there was an independent review of the migration system, and there was also an independent review of exploitation of migrant workers. And the government used the findings and the recommendations from those reports to develop a migration strategy. And that strategy was published in December of last year, which looked at some pretty significant changes to the migration system, and some changes which have already taken place. So there have been some significant changes to the skilled migration system and the way that program is going to be administered. There's been some...
What are some of those changes, just quickly, just high level from the skilled perspective?
Right, so right now there's a whole different array of visas which are available to service skilled migration needs, and they're looking to narrow it down to three types of visas. So there's the highly skilled, I think they call it the talent visa, talent something visa.
Okay.
There's the core skill visa, which is really the skilled visa that you'd use to get most of your skilled labour in
Okay.
The core skills visa, and then the essential skills visa, which is really looking at lower skilled work. And each of those is sort of going to replace a network of visa systems, network of visa options, which are out there right now.
Okay, so simplifying the system by the sounds of it.
That's the ideal, yeah.
Yeah.
And making sure the system, the labour migration system talks to the labour needs of the country on a broader sort of way.
Yeah, it's been a little bit hit and miss, I think, with some of the visa categories from a skilled migration perspective and the medium stream, short stream categories.
It's confusing. There's regional migrations. There's employee initiated migration. There's employer initiated migration. There's labour agreements. There's DARMAs. There's all these different plethora of different types of visa pathways. So they are trying to make it simpler, and we welcome that. And the simplicity is not just so that the migrants and the employers understand the system better, but it also makes it easier for the government to administer. So one of the things that we hear about a lot is just the timeframes and how long it takes from the date you decide as an employer that you need to bring in a migrant to fill a role on the farm.
I've done it twice and it takes forever.
Yeah, so the idea is to make that much simpler, much more streamlined and much quicker.
Yeah, no, it's quite an onerous process, and there's a whole lot of obligation that, hopefully if they can streamline that, it might make things a whole lot easier for employers. But the unskilled or low skilled visa is quite interesting. We did have talk of the ag visa that was going to come about, which we know has taken on agreement in some form underneath the MOU with Vietnam. So I think by opening up pathways for migration in a simpler capacity is going to be a whole lot better for everybody involved.
Yeah, that's the hope.
On the back of the migration review, and we're talking about the 88 days and the changes to that visa, we know that the requirement for 88 days for UK workers has already been removed. And I know that that's had a massive implication on our industry in particular already.
Yep.
Do you see there being a fundamental change with the reduction of 88 days being a necessity for other countries?
Yeah, so we talked at the outset about the Jobs and Skills Australia capacity study.
Yes.
They've been asked to look at migration. They've been asked specifically to look at the 88 days and the use of backpackers. And now there is a regional migration review which is taking place. That review is looking at backpackers, the use of backpackers and the 88 days. There is a perception within government that the 88 days, and this is a quote, drives exploitation.
It's a very strong inflammatory
it is,
quote.
And it's not necessarily something I would agree with.
Yep.
We accept that there are issues within some of the agricultural workforce, and those issues need to be addressed. So we're comfortable with that idea, but getting rid of the 88 days is a hard line for us. That's a red line, can't cross it.
Yeah.
The 88 days, backpackers are a vital source of labour for the agriculture sector. Horticulture in particular, of course, but agriculture more generally. I mean, I think you'd be surprised to learn how reliant dairy farms, piggeries, cane, cotton, grains are on livestock. Every part of the agriculture industry relies upon backpackers, needs backpackers as a source of labour. They get rid of the 88 days, then they're going to deprive us of that source of labour. It would be catastrophic.
Absolutely it would, and if we don't have the Australian labour workforce who are prepared to work in those jobs, we have no other way other than migrant workers to be able to fulfil those positions.
Exactly right, and the government seems to think that palm is the solution for that need, and it is a solution. There's absolutely no doubt about that. For the businesses for whom palm works, it's absolutely fantastic, but it doesn't work for everyone, and it doesn't satisfy every single type of labour need that's out there within the farming sector.
I think you need to have a multi-pronged approach when you're looking at labour. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
No.
There has to be a range that people can pick and choose from to suit the needs of their business. So the risk of the 88 days being removed, we know that the implication is going to be massive on industry if that does happen. If that does happen, what are some of the alternatives that we can look at adopting into business now, or that businesses should be aware of that might be available to them to take advantage of?
Well, I mean, obviously we just talked about palm, so I think for the horticulture sector, that's going to be a significant piece of the answer to the puzzle, right? So we saw that during COVID.
Do you not see palm also being tricky now that they've opened up to other industries that agriculture might be a less attractive industry for palm workers, where they might like
I think
to
that's
work
a real
in
I think that's a real
retail
risk.
and hospitality. And
I think that's an absolute real risk. Yeah, I mean, by far, if you look at the numbers, agriculture is still the biggest user of that program.
yes,
But they are opening it up to other sectors. Now, they would say, they being the government, would say that there is a huge labour pool over in the Pacific who are looking to come over and take these jobs. So you expand it into other sectors, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to lose those workers within agriculture. But I absolutely think that's a risk, and I think you'd be a little bit naive to suggest that it's not. I think you'd also be a little bit naive to suggest that there aren't pressures internationally around that labour pool and some of the things that and some of the experiences in the sending nations around their appetite to be a part of that program. So we have to be mindful of all of these things. We put all of our eggs in that basket,
yeah,
and we drop that basket, or that basket gets dropped.
Yep.
Where does that leave us? It leaves us up the creek. So yeah,
Mess.
you said earlier we need to have a toolkit of solutions, and we do need to have a toolkit of solutions, and Backpackers is absolutely part of that toolkit.
yep, yep. What else could we look at? We know that we've got industry labour agreements, and we spoke a little earlier about the horticulture industry labour agreement.
Yes.
I don't know if many people might know what that looks like. Would you mind just sort of giving us a brief overview as to what that could be utilised as a tool or as a mechanism to be able to bring either additional labour, or is there a way that if there are current workers in Australia like palm workers, could there be a recategorisation then using HILA as a permanent residency pathway, for example?
Yeah, so the HILA it's a labour agreement, as we said. So that's what it means is that there is a template sort of form which has been negotiated by the horticulture sector, and I think AusVeg was fundamental in that, and Growcom too, which has been negotiated with the government. And an employer can have a look at their labour needs and say, well, we need to bring in someone through one of these labour agreements. Mm-hmm. And those labour agreements specify a range of different occupations which you can bring someone into the country to work on over a long time. I think it's around about 3 to 6 years. Okay. So,
what if you've got someone on your books now who might be a current palm worker, but they've come in underneath the palm scheme as a low or unskilled worker, but you like to have them with you long term? Can you see a way to be able to transition them through either a recategorisation of their employment or their job title or their job function, if they're perhaps maybe be able to be trained and upskilled while they're with us underneath the palm scheme, and then brought back in underneath
Absolutely,
HILA?
yeah. You'd have to make sure they can slot into one of those occupations
Yeah.
which is covered by the HILA. And there's around, I can't remember the exact number if I'm honest with you, but there's quite a few. There's about a dozen. They range from fairly skilled occupations right down to fairly unskilled, semi-skilled roles. Theoretically, you're not supposed to have people on unskilled roles, so your level 1 pickers and packers aren't going to be on the HILA. But at some of those higher level roles, they could come in through the HILA. So if you have someone on your farm who's a backpacker or a palm worker,
Yeah.
and they're working out and they want to stick around, then theoretically they could move into a role under the HILA.
Yeah.
But
So it's an option employers can explore at least anyway.
it's an option, yeah. And another option, we referred earlier to some of the changes which they're making to the migration system, and I talked about a lower skilled pathway, and we don't know what that's going to look like just yet, but
Which
they
you
are
called essential skills?
essential skills visa, yeah. So we don't know exactly what that looks like yet. We think that will probably take, if not all, then at least some of the role which is currently being serviced by those labour agreements. But the expectation is that it will be for those lower skilled roles. So there will be another pathway. Mm-hmm. It will be very much employer driven, and it will not necessarily be centred on one nation or a handful of nations like the Palm.
Yes.
But there will be a period of negotiation with the department, and there will be obligations under those agreements on the employers.
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, we know that we've got a multitude of different visa categories, and in the ag industry, thank goodness, there is a bit of an exemption where there hasn't got to be a limitation of 6 months of working in the ag industry for those visa holders. So I think that's one blessing, but I think making the visa system easier to navigate is much better for employers, either A, looking at sourcing labour from overseas, and also too for migrant workers wanting to come across and work in Australia. It certainly seems like migration, as much as we know or as much as we feel that there's a sentiment that it's adding to a lot of, potential housing crises and all that sort of stuff as far as accommodation and that is concerned, we need those numbers in our workforce. It's as simple as that. We just don't seem to have the people who are Australian workers filling and applying for those jobs.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing from you is there is no one silver bullet to fix this problem, and there is no short-term solution, that everything that's being looked at is potentially a long-term system to be implemented to drive change through policy and through government and through visa transitions, etc. But do we have any hope at the light at the end of the tunnel, do you think? I mean, our workforce shortages, we seem to hear these reports and surveys and submissions that are done year after year after year, and going back even to sort of, I think, to 2014, I found one where it's the same rhetoric.
You could go back a lot further than that. Yeah, I mean, it's a perennial problem.
Yeah.
And I don't really think there are any short-term solutions. I mean, we talk a lot about promoting ag careers and providing those pathways into ag careers. And the government, to its credit, has done a lot to try and encourage that in terms of, the vet system, making the vet system more amenable to the needs of agriculture. The current government has
so there were some free TAFE studies, vet studies, etc. for those ag courses?
Free TAFE places for ag courses.
Yep.
There's some money in last year's budget to try and promote, to enable or to fund universities to promote the uptake of ag careers for their current students, which is a great initiative. There's a lot of work being done just to promote ag careers more generally. So the NFF is running a program which is absolutely fantastic called Ag Career Start, which gives young people who might not otherwise have had an opportunity to experience farm life to go and do basically a gap year after school, experience working on farm, get an understanding of farm and realise that it might be for them even if historically they haven't had any connection with the land. That's a fantastic program, and I'd encourage your viewers to go and have a look at it, and if they're running a farm...
Ag Career Start.
Ag Career Start, yeah.
Great.
Yeah. It's a really exciting program. But all of these sorts of initiatives, they're really looking at skilled labour shortages and careers within farm work. But the pressure we hear about a lot really is more in that unskilled space, and I don't see any other solution in the short term in terms of covering the field outside of migration. And that's going to be the toolkit we talked about earlier. That's going to be PALM, that's going to be backpackers, and maybe one day that'll be an ag visa.
Yeah, maybe. Well, fingers crossed it might be. I think, when we have a look at what are some of the other solutions, they all cost money and investment. So, you could talk about robotics, from a robotic picking mechanism.
Yes. You
can talk about other sorts of things, but they all require a large investment of funds in being able to build that infrastructure. And it's not something that a business can implement overnight as well.
Absolutely not. Robotics, mechanisation, that probably is the future, but it's a fairly distant future at this point, and we've seen leaps and bounds in terms of growth in technology and what machines can do, but we're not there yet, and as you say, it's expensive. So one day maybe, but not yet, not tomorrow.
So in a nutshell, the focus of our workforce needs is greater than what our workforce capacity is at the moment to be able to fulfil those needs.
Absolutely.
And we don't see that being remedied anytime soon.
No, and I mean the reality is that there have been programs which have encouraged Aussies to go and do these jobs, and those programs have varying degrees of success. But the reality is that for the foreseeable future, we're going to need migrant workers as well.
Yeah. Okay.
No doubt about it.
Well, that's the message in a nutshell, then, really, isn't it? Is we need to accept that as the current state of play.
That's right. We need to accept it. The government needs to accept it.
Yeah. So, from that, which is potentially a frightening impact on our labour market, and it's a very high strategic level view, we've had some changes that have now come into effect really at the coalface for growers. And if we can start with that first one, which is the change to the definition of a casual employee.
Yep.
I thought we'd kind of settled on a definition. We had full-time, part-time, casual people. That's kind of gone out the window now. What is the change all about?
So there's a bit of history to this one, and that history kind of commenced about 15 years ago, but probably earlier. And there's been a sort of a oscillation between various definitions of casual and what is a casual worker and what that looks like within your workforce. And on the one extreme, you've got the contractual definition. So if there's an employment contract, an agreement, an arrangement between the employer and the employee that the worker is a casual and they're paid their loading and they're treated accordingly, then they are a casual. And that's the position going forward. And so that was the position historically. Then there were some court cases, then there was some legislation, then there was some more court cases, and now there's some more legislation, and in amongst all that there were award variations and all sorts of things. So the position really has gone backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards quite a bit.
It's not an easy space to navigate as an employer, right?
No, I mean, if you start getting into my sort of more theoretical brain, to me this is the tension point between our IR system and the regimented workforce system we have, and the needs for flexibility that businesses have, and this is where those two things tend to butt up against each other. So why it's such a controversial space. So where we are at now is there was some legislation which was introduced, to Parliament about 6 months ago, about a year ago. Forgetting the date exactly, but it's come into effect back in the end of August, which requires employers to be mindful of the way they use their labour. So it doesn't necessarily matter what the employer, what the employee is called. If you call your worker a casual, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a casual.
Right.
Just because they're paid the casual loading doesn't necessarily mean they're a casual, although that's an important criteria.
An important criteria.
Yeah. So what it is now.
Distinction.
Yes.
Yeah.
The way you work it out is what we call a lawyer would call it a multifactorial test. So you look at the entire nature of the employment to determine whether or not they are a casual. You look at things like a commitment to work into the future, a routine and a pattern of work, expectations around requirements to work, whether or not the casual can refuse the work. Yeah, all those sorts of things. You need to really look at the entire sort of employment landscape.
Yeah, the package per employee.
Yes, to figure out whether or not this person is a casual employer, a casual employee. If they're not, then we get into the rights to casual conversion, which we can go to now if you like.
Yes, I'd love that was a good segue. Thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Casual conversion, because that space has changed as well.
That space has changed as well. So previously, if the employee was of the view that they weren't being treated as a casual worker because of those things like the pattern of work and the commitments and those sorts of things, they could say, well, actually, I'd like to be converted to a part-timer, probably, or a full-timer, so in some sort of non-casual ongoing position. That changed again with this change to the legislation. So the situation we're at now is in those circumstances where the employee says they don't believe that they satisfy that definition of casual, they can say, right, I now want to be considered to be a permanent employee.
So this is an entitlement that the employee is in the power to instigate that conversion request.
Yes. So they make the request, and there are very limited circumstances in which the employer can deny it, but basically if in my view, if they've satisfied the definition, so they've got the right to make the request, then it's going to be very difficult for the employer to say no, because basically the only grounds on which they can say no is if they can't accommodate it within their business, or they'd have to make massive changes to their business. And the reality is if the employee has been working in that capacity for 6 months, they don't need to make changes because they're already doing it. So unless there's something coming down
unless the season stops in 2 weeks' time, and that fundamentally can't occur, then we get that.
Then they might not. Then the employer might be able to refuse.
Yeah.
But they have. It's something that the employer is definitely going to have to be aware of as a change to business.
Yeah, and I think as an on the grounds, boots on the ground, getting muddy kind of thing, there's the new obligation for an employer to provide the casual employment information statement every 6 months.
Every 6 months, that's
to
correct.
their casual employees
That's
as
correct,
well.
yeah.
So I think it must feed off the back of the Secure Jobs Better Pay when that bill was brought into play to go, we want people to be in long-term secure employment, and this is one of the initiatives that I think may have unfolded from that.
That's a philosophical motivation of the Labor government, and you can see why. I mean, they want to make sure that there are jobs there for people, and they have the security of employment going forward. That's a priority of theirs. The impact upon business can occasionally get lost when they're pursuing those sorts of agendas.
Yeah.
So,
maybe we need to spotlight the impact on business a little more for them.
Well, we're doing that. We're doing our best.
Yeah.
It's just a question of how much weight that carries with the current government.
Well,
Without
that's a
getting too
wait and
political.
see, isn't it? Yeah, exactly
yeah.
right. And it was just when we thought we were finally getting our heads around employment statuses and definitions.
Yes, there is one thing that I'd like to point out, which is a change to the legislation, which I think is pretty critical, which is that we talked about the employee electing to become a permanent or a part-timer or a full-timer, moving over from being casual. But the important point to note, and the change to some of that historical position, is that until they actually make that election, until they say, I want to be a permanent or a part-timer, they remain a casual. That's important because historically, when it was blurred, well, it kind of is now, there was scope for the employee to be treated by the employer as a casual, so paid the casual loading, but actually be a permanent. So accruing entitlements, accruing leave entitlements, so that when employment came to an end, and there are a couple of court cases about this, when employment came to an end, despite the fact that they've been receiving the 25% loading or whatever it might be, they said, well, actually, no, I was a full-timer or I was a part-timer, I was accruing leave, so you now need to pay out my leave. And of course, the employer said, well, hang on a second, I was paying loading. But unfortunately, those employers didn't distinguish when they were making the pay what the base rate was, what the base pay was, what the casual loading was.
And any other allowance that
and
they were
any
being
other
paid
allowances,
for?
they just paid them a loaded rate. They paid them a flat, let's say $50 an hour,
Yeah.
and that covered all their entitlements as far as they were concerned, but they didn't break it down for the employee when they were handing over that pay. And so the court said, I can't figure that out. That's just, I can't sort of unpick the omelette. So I'm not going to deal with that. So no right to offset, which is what the employer would have been arguing.
Yes.
I paid the casual loading 25%, so if I now owe you those leave entitlements I have to pay out, then I can offset the casual loading payment against those leave entitlements. The court said, no, I can't do that.
Yeah. So it's double dipping going
So
on
double
in
dipping,
effect.
yeah.
And even though the employer was doing the right thing, thinking that they were paying someone under a casual arrangement, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter until things go wrong, right? So
Yeah,
you've got to have it
that's
all
right.
set clearly,
Right.
and the expectation and the understanding at the outset. But
But
the
the-
offset clause is what you were.
Yes, so there's now in the legislation, this was actually introduced back in 2020, there is a legislative right to that offset as well. So you've got the legislative right to an offset, and you've got the employee election provisions, which mean that the employee does not become a permanent or a part-timer until they make that election, so everybody knows where they stand.
Yep.
So the employer should be paying the casual loading because until that change happens, so they know what they have to pay. So there should be no overpayments in that way.
Yeah, good.
So that's better than it was sort of back in 2019.
It does put the power into the hands of the
But
employees.
it does change there. It does.
And there is a difference in that power dynamic then for an employee saying, hey, I want to do this now. I don't know whether that's going to have a massive impact because as we were discussing earlier, when employees, in my experience, have been offered casual conversion, they don't want to take the lesser hourly pay rate with the accrued entitlements being paid out at the end. They want the higher amount in their bank account every fortnight, every week, paid to them with that loading each time.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the impact for the agricultural sector is actually putting aside all the confusion, and I don't really understand what's going on, and you and I are having to have these discussions to try and explain to people, and it's constant change, and what that means for the admin and so forth, which is, let's not understate that.
Yeah.
But in terms of practical impact, I actually think it's going to be relatively minor for the ag sector, or at least for horticulture. I don't think it's going to affect the seasonal roles, because I just don't think that they're long enough.
Yeah.
And because you've got all these safeguards built in, like the election process, and because most casual workers, particularly at the level 1 rates, they're probably going to want their 25% loading. I don't think most of them will make that election. I don't think they'll make that choice to forego the 25% loading.
No.
But it's still wait and see. It's very early days yet, and we've still got to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see how that one rolls out. But it's just this constant flux of change. I think that people get frustrated with, and a business gets frustrated with, that they've got to understand that this landscape is constantly fluid, and they've got to understand what their obligations are so they're compliant all the time.
And you can't just say, I have a business, I have a need, I can fill that need by pulling someone in and giving them a job.
Yeah.
And that's the end of it.
That comes with a whole lot of
That comes with a whole bunch of,
Yeah.
whole massive overlay.
Yeah, a whole raft of issues.
And the reality is, I mean, the way I like to put it is, a business has a problem, an employee can solve that problem, so they employ somebody. That's the way it should work.
Yep.
But what they have to also understand is that employing someone also introduces a whole
No.
another set of problems. And so that's going to be an assessment that a business has to make. It's problem A, better or worse than problem B.
Yeah. Yeah,
You know,
sure.
yeah,
I like that analogy.
Small business, that's going to be a real assessment that they need to
Yeah,
make.
it is. But we've also got another banger of a change which has come, which is this working from home provisions. And I don't know if we've had a look at what, you and I have had a discussion around what this long-term implication can be. But for our viewers out there, would you mind speaking a bit to what this new inclusion in the Clerks Award, because that very well may impact some of our viewers and our growers moving forward with how they run their businesses?
Well, it could affect, it could have a couple of implications. Yeah, it could affect the admin roles and the bookkeeping roles and that sort of thing. So, important rider, there hasn't been any change yet. It's currently going through the Fair Work Commission.
Yes.
They're running a process. and it's sort of a trial process to come up with a model provision for the Clerks Award around rights to work from home, the circumstances in which the request can be made, the circumstances in which the request can be denied or has to be granted. We don't really know what that's going to look like yet, so I don't really want to preempt that. My guess is that where we'll land is that in certain circumstances, an employee will be entitled to say, well, I want to work from home, and there'll be limited, a little bit like the casual conversion type arrangements, there'll be limited circumstances in which an employer can say no. But I think probably those circumstances will include business needs, they will include productivity. You probably won't be able to deny a request on the basis that that would have a negative impact on your productivity. You'd probably have to spell out exactly what that is in some detail. But I don't think it's going to be a blanket entitlement to work from home. I think it's going to be broader than it is now. But the important thing to bear in mind is that there already is kind of an entitlement to work from home.
Individual flexibility agreements.
Well, so there's that, yes, absolutely, but there is a right to flexibility. So an employee right now can make a right within certain circumstances, if they have certain needs, age, disability, care requirements, they can make requests for flexible working arrangements, and there are only limited grounds in which the employer can deny those requests.
So we already have a mechanism.
Already sort of have it in there in the
employee-
legislation. Now it's a little bit more limited than probably what will come out of the Commission, but it is already there. And I was just reading a decision of the Commission the other day in which an employee who had care arrangements asked, not in the agriculture sector, asked to be able to work from home permanently, and the employer said, no, you can work from home. I think it was around about 3 days a week, but we want you in the office 2 days a week.
Yep.
And the employer, the justification for that denial was things like productivity, was the sort of community of work and the relationships with friends and the collaboration and all those sorts of things, but they kept their explanation at a very high level. They didn't actually detail how it would actually impact on the workplace. They just used that sort of broad language like productivity, collaboration, yada yada. And the Commission said no. The Commission said, you know what, I don't reckon 3 days is right, I don't reckon 5 days working from home is right, why don't we split the difference and we'll come in with 4 days. So the employee was entitled to work from home 4 days, had to come in 1 day.
Wow.
And then there's an obligation to review those arrangements in a couple of months' time. But the point to be made is that it's kind of already there. It'll be probably a little bit more, that right to work from home will probably be a little bit more robust. There'll be a little bit more structure around the entitlement and the decision-making process. But it is kind of already there.
Yeah, it is there already. I think it's a real shame, though, that you end up, if you've got someone who's already working from home and they request to work from home full time, but you end up in a dispute situation, you know, that surely that tarnishes it tarnishes the relationship between the employer and the employee to have the Commission decide on how you're going to work together.
I mean, yeah, I think it's really unfortunate that you have a third party coming in over the top and saying, no, this is the way it's going to be. And, you know, in theory, that's someone balancing the interests of everybody and not being, you know, coming from a certain standpoint. But on the other hand, they're not really there at the coalface understanding the way things operate. So I don't know if it's ideal. But anyway, that's where it is.
That's right. One of the last things that we did table to discuss was this C14 decision and how that may play out in horticulture in particular. So providing context for our viewers that the Fair Work Commission sets the national minimum wage, and we know that our Level 1 Hort award is currently lower than the national minimum wage. Do you want to have a chat about what you've seen in the way of the determinations and the submissions that have been made for that change for the C14? We know that it's coming, but we don't know what the exact looks like. But can you speak to that a little bit more?
I can. If you can indulge me, I might just give a bit of background, if that's
please,
okay.
Thank you.
So yeah, this is it's a fairly messy space, if I'm honest with you. The C14 rate, which your viewers might not know what C14 stands for. They know that it means the Level 1 rate right now, but where that title, that language came from. Yeah, so it is actually the Level 1 rate within the manufacturing award. Yeah. So the way, historically the way it worked is that it was actually the Industrial Relations Commission, which was the predecessor of the Fair Work Commission. When they were establishing the modern awards, they said, well, we need to come up with a base rate of pay. And so they just basically picked up the C14 rate from the manufacturer award and plonked it into pretty much every award. Now, rightly or wrongly, in the manufacturing award, there was a firm cap on how long someone could work at that Level 1 rate, and it was pretty clear within the decision which was reached by the Industrial Relations Commission back then that was a short time frame in order for the
training, induction.
Yeah, to learn the absolute basics of the business. And I can't remember the exact time frame, but let's say it was around about I think it was around about
Someone 3 or
38
6
hours.
months. Yeah,
I think
okay.
it was 38 hours, but don't quote me on that. But the point is that it was a very brief time frame in order for the person to learn the absolute basics of the role before they would progress to the next rate, to the C13 rate. Now that C14 rate was picked up and plonked, as I say, into a whole bunch of other awards, but in some cases that clear time frame fell away.
As it did in the Hort.
So in the Hort Award, and you can still see a bit of a relic of that time frame in the Hort Award, where I think it talks about the 38 hours, or is it 2 weeks of structured training. In level 1, you're supposed to undertake 2 weeks of structured training. No, it doesn't say, and there's been arguments about this, but it doesn't say, and in my view, in its current
How or what?
language, it doesn't say you have to go up after that 2 weeks of
Yeah.
structured training. It just says you're going to undertake 2 weeks of structured training during, or you could be undertaking 2 weeks of structured training during that initial period at the level 1 rate. And there are other awards in which it's expressed differently. So in the pastoral award, which has a whole bunch of different classifications for the different commodities which are covered, it's treated differently.
Yeah.
So if you-
Viticulture is 6 months.
Sure, but
Yeah.
if you look at, so in the livestock industry, it talks about 12-month,
Yeah.
a 12-month transition period. You can only be at level 1 rates for 12 months, and then you, depending on what industry you're in, you can graduate to level 2 or level 3 rates. In the piggeries provision, it talks about, again, that 38-hour induction process. Not really clear that that is an automatic transition after that 38 hours.
Okay.
So it's handled differently throughout the awards, but in a lot of the awards there is definitely this sort of shadow of the time frame,
Yep.
but not a clear distinction, not a clear line. Once you've reached that time frame, you move over. So what the Commission decided about 2 years ago is that that's a historical anomaly, and we're going to get rid of that. Level 1 rates are only supposed to be for a short time while you learnt the basics of the role, and we're going to reintroduce that to all the awards. So it wasn't just the Hort Award, wasn't just the Hort Award and the Pastoral Award, it was every award.
Yeah.
And there were about 70 which they were reviewing towards the end of last year. And all of those 70 awards now are going to have requirements to transition from level 1 to level 2, from
Yeah.
C13 to C14, C14 to C13.
C13. Yeah.
Yeah, so what does that mean for the Hort Award?
Yeah, what does it mean for the Hort Award? That's the golden question,
Yeah,
right?
so, well, still a bit up in the air if I'm honest with you, but so they're going to introduce language which says that a level 1 worker can only be at those level 1 rates, or worker can only be at those level 1 rates while they have less than 3 months industry experience.
Right. Industry experience.
Yeah.
We need to pick that apart.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So, good question. And there are different views about how that's going to work. I think, as it currently stands, the way you look at it is, because that word industry is actually defined in the Horticultural Award to mean the horticulture industry, it would mean 3 months experience, you know, on any farm, in any
enterprise,
commodity,
in the industry.
in any fruit or vegetable farm. Yeah, that's right. So you got 3 months working on 3 months picking apples, then you go into level 2 if you were to go into, sort of growing watermelons or whatever it might be, picking asparagus, whatever it might be, potatoes, mushrooms, whatever it might be.
Yeah. So the crop
nuts.
and commodity won't matter?
Well, so that's one approach.
Yep.
And I think as it currently stands, that's probably the way that the Commission would say it should be approached. But we have certainly made submissions. I don't know, other industry bodies have made submissions saying, well, actually, that's way too broad, because the experience you pick up with one crop,
Yeah.
with nuts, almonds, whatever it might be, is going to be very different to what it might be with another crop.
Yeah. Harvesting
mangoes
lettuce or
lettuce, yeah, leafy
bananas.
greens, whatever it might be. Yeah. So we've said, well, it can't be that broad. Some industries have said, well, you need to look at the particular produce, whatever it might be, the particular commodity. We've said, and our members have encouraged us to say, well, how about we distinguish between ground crops and tree crops? So 3 months experience with a ground crop won't necessarily entitle you to level 2 rates when you're working with tree crops.
Yeah.
So that's one way to approach it, but
Sure.
we're still waiting to see where the Commission might land on that. But we've made those submissions.
And then the 3 months. So industry is one contentious area, and then the timeframe's a contentious area.
Yep,
So
indeed.
does the 3 months start from the commencement of employment, or is it 3 months of equivalent full-time hours over a 3-month period, which might not really be achieved for 6 months, for
Yep.
example?
Yep.
Is there some conversation going on around how the timeframe will be calculated?
Yeah, so we've said it should be the hourly equivalent. And really, that's as much, 2 reasons for that. There is, if you just look at the 3 months starting to commence running from the date you first work,
Yep.
then there could be a situation in which a casual worker does a couple of days a week, couple of hours on those days, they're casual.
Yeah.
Like, we've just had the discussion. It's not set how much they'll work,
Yeah.
but they're probably not going to do the full-time hours. So that could run for a long, long time. And exactly knowing when that will begin and when that will end will be very, very ambiguous. Will be
Yeah.
unclear. So in order to get clarity around what those entitlements are, and then looking to move from one farm to another, which may very well happen. It
Is
happens
it
a lot.
portable? Is it transferable between employers?
And how do they know? So,
Yeah.
if the employee said, well, I started work, a month ago, well, does that mean you've got done 1 month every 3 months? Or, how many hours did you work during that period? So breaking it down into hours just makes it much clearer, much
Easier to administer.
easier to
timeframe.
administer, easier to understand. So
Yeah.
that's the submission we've made. That makes a heck of a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
But again, we don't really know where the Commission's going to go with that. And I know there are other commodities which are saying, well, just 3 months is 3 months, let's not overcomplicate this. And there's an argument there.
Yeah, sure.
So, yeah.
Sure. And that might be the case for some areas and some commodities, but certainly I know that the horticulture industry is very, very keen to get it actually crystal clear as to what the expectation is going to be, so they know how to implement that within the business. But the proposed start date for this is actually 1st of January next year?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, okay.
And we've made submissions saying, well, actually, it would make much better sense if it started on 1 July, which
Yeah.
is when any
change for pay rates and all that sort of stuff comes through too.
Any wage review will kick in. So, and the employers will already have systems set up to sort of accommodate that. They'll be aware there's changes coming through they need to accommodate already. So that would make a lot of sense to us, but I'm not hugely optimistic, if I'm honest with you. I think the Commission in the past has demonstrated when they decide on a date, they like to stick to that date.
Yeah,
and there can be a lot of solid arguments why another date would be better, but
that's right.
they've made the decision.
That's right. So we always open up the avenue to have our viewers submit questions into these, and we've had a number of questions submitted for you under this talk specifically. The first one is in regards to casual conversion eligibility. So if a casual employee works mostly the same days each week, however the hours are unpredictable depending on the crop, is this considered as regular and systematic? As workers could be sent home any time during the day, and there's no set times due to the crop and market demands on a daily basis. So when we talk about our casual conversion, what does that look like in that instance?
Yeah, so I think in the instance which was described there, almost certainly not. So we said, I think some of the language was mostly.
Mostly, yes. Mostly same.
Yeah.
However, the hours are unpredictable depending on the crop.
So all that stuff speaks to me as that there's no pattern of work, there's no ongoing commitment in the way that the legislation would expect. So I think almost certainly not there.
Yep.
I'd place a couple of riders, one of which is we haven't yet seen exactly how the courts are going to interpret these provisions, and the legislature, the minister, they have one view of the way things should work. The people who are reading it, once it's come through Parliament, have a view of the way things should work. Judges might take a different view. So you need to be a little bit careful about that, but I don't think in those circumstances that person would qualify as part-time.
Yeah.
And the other important piece to remember is that even if the hours were initially that sort of irregularity, which I think that question describes, but over time they become more and more permanent. We talked about the election process.
Yes.
So even if they do become more permanent, and a pattern does emerge and a commitment does start to materialise, it's not until the employee says, well, actually now I want to be permanent, that transition would occur. So it's not going to happen sort of by stealth, which is one of those concerns with the historical situation we were discussing.
Yep. All right, great. So the employee elects, the employee notifies the employer that they'd like to be a casual, and that's the date that we start from. I'd like to be a permanent.
Or part-time, but ongoing.
However it would go.
Yeah.
Okay, good. That sounds like an easy answer for that one. Will the move from level 1 to level 2 impact existing enterprise agreements?
I think the answer to that is almost certainly no. So the whole reason you get an enterprise agreement is to take yourself outside of that award arrangement. So there are a couple of riders there. When there's a change to base rates, then they get incorporated into an enterprise agreement. This is not a change to a base rate, it's a change to the classification system, so I don't think it would carry across.
If hang on, I'm going to interject there. If an enterprise agreement refers to the classifications in the horde industry underneath their EA, to say that they'll align with those classifications?
Yeah, so that's the other situation. I think probably in that case it would carry over. And the third situation is, of course, won't affect your current arrangements under your EAs, probably, but the negotiations going forward are probably going to have to countenance these changes. So both in terms of your discussions with your employee or reps, they're going to probably want to see transition arrangements in level 1 type
Yeah.
pay rates, depending on what the rate is. And again, if your level 1 rate is above the C13, then it might be escape of this all, and very often they are.
Yeah.
So it might escape all this discussion altogether. And then of course boot test, when the Commission has a look at the boot test and makes sure that the employees are better off overall,
Yes.
they'll want to have regard to these transitional arrangements and
Yeah.
whether or not the EA
Would
needs
there
to
be
have a
more
similar
advantage
stuff.
being underneath the Hort Award or not?
Exactly.
Yeah. This is a bit of a curious question. Implications on farmers not following Horticulture Award implementations. I think that's it's a blanket question. It's not really specific to anything that we've spoken about, but at the end of the day,
Well, it could be to the C.
it could be to the C14.
Yeah,
it could be
to piece rates. I mean,
to lots of things, but
yeah, and that's a really open question. So it depends on a whole range of different factors. And the first is there's an assumption built on that question that the employees would be covered by the Hort Award. They may not be. We just talked about EAs.
Yeah.
They could be under the Clerks Award if they're in the office. I mean, there's a whole bunch of ways which they may not be covered by the Hort Award.
Let's assume you're an award-based employer, though.
Yep.
Regardless of what award you're in, if
So-
you're not following your award requirements, you're in breach of the award.
You're in breach of the award. Yeah.
Simple.
So you're in breach of the award. What does that mean? It's going to depend on a whole range of factors. I mean, I don't want anyone to leave this conversation thinking that it's going to be okay, because
No,
it's not.
it's not.
But if you're not aware that you're in breach of the award because of a mistake,
Yeah.
then that's going to be different to if you did it
Intentionally.
intentionally. And we haven't talked about
Wage
criminalisation
theft yet.
of
No,
wage
we
theft,
have
but
not.
that's going to have implications if you do this sort of stuff intentionally, or
Yeah.
know the Hort Award says one thing and you do something
Deliberately else.
yeah, it's going to depend on what you did to try and make amends. So if you didn't realise you were doing the wrong thing, then you picked it up when you were going over your books, you went straight to the employee and said, hang on, it looks like I actually underpaid you, for example. I'll make it up to you, and
Yeah.
maybe there's some interest, I don't know, it depends how long ago it might have been. You do all that sort of stuff, and then you go to the Fair Work Ombudsman and say, gee, I screwed up, but I've paid the employee back and I know what I'm supposed to do going forward. So, is that all right? The Fair Work Ombudsman will say, well, I mean, I don't know what they'll say. It's up to the Fair Work Ombudsman, but my guess is they'll say, make sure you fix that up. Don't do that again, and we'll come and check on you in 6
Yeah.
months' time. But you look like
Well done for remedying
Yeah,
it.
you're trying to fix it up. We get it. It's complicated. We're not going to come down on you like a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
So
Which is
it's
different to deliberately trying
or hiding it,
or hiding it.
or just saying,
Yeah,
you know.
don't-
So it really depends on the situation. But I mean, the short answer is, if you don't follow the award and you're supposed to, then you're exposing yourself to prosecutions by the Fair Work Commission, investigations, penalty notices, and of course interventions from the unions.
Yeah.
All stuff that probably on farm you're not going to be too excited about. So strongly encourage, even if you don't like the award, you need to follow it. And if you don't like the award, then probably it wouldn't be a bad idea to start having a look at an enterprise agreement.
Yeah.
And
And if you don't want to
tailoring
go
it to
down
your
that
needs.
pathway, go back to the award.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yep.
Yeah, but you don't really have an option there.
No. We do have a question here that's been submitted in regards to the administration or appropriate administration of the PALM program, under the assumption that all seasonal workers are vulnerable people, with us as employers or hosts having an unethical power imbalance. Now, I know we haven't really spoken on it, and you're happy for me to forward this question to you. We're desperate to try and get somebody from PALM to come and chat to our viewers, so we're really hoping that that will occur soon. But how, I suppose really this person's really trying to reach out to say, well, how do we ensure that we're doing the right thing when there's a perceived unethical power imbalance?
Yeah, I mean, I read that question as just an expression of frustration around changes to the award, the expectations that there are on employers in
Yep.
terms of pastoral care costs. And we're really sympathetic to that. I get it. And the
Yeah.
recent changes to the award, not to the award, to
To the
the
PALM Deed and Guidelines.
PALM and Deed and Guidelines have been really difficult for a lot of growers to absorb. And a lot of those changes have been premised on these sorts of arrangements. So
Yeah.
I get that frustration. At present, you've got to comply.
Yeah.
There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you're having difficulty complying, then you need to talk to the department, your administrators, and your client contact within the department. It's a difficult situation, and we're certainly talking to the government about it. I mean, there was recently some relief around the guarantee of 30 hours.
Average over 4 weeks.
Yeah, you can still average over 4 weeks. There was an intention to introduce a flat requirement for 30 hours. They've given industry a little bit of leeway on that one, and they're going to revisit it again before the end of the year and come up with some sort of final solution, final answer to that problem. So, we are having those discussions. We're trying to talk to government about how we can free up some of this red tape and this burden, but at present you've got no choice. You need to comply if you want to use that program.
Yeah, that's right. It is all about compliance with the commercial arrangement you've entered into.
Yep.
This is the last one we've got, and we certainly touched about this when we were working out the C14, C13. Given the seasonal variability in on-farm tasks over any given year, pruning, weeding, checking and repairing to irrigation systems, fruit picking, some by hand, some by machine, etc., is it reasonable for legislators to suggest that someone with 3 months' experience at a single point in this annual cycle of tasks is proficient in all tasks throughout the cycle, and so automatically is upgraded to a level 2?
Yes. I'm just going to be a bit of a lawyer and pick up one of the things that's in that question. It talks about the legislature,
Yep.
and I think it's really important to realise it's not the legislature that did this, it's the Fair Work Commission.
Yep.
And that the reason I pick up on that is because I don't know people always understand that the Fair Work Commission, although they are sort of a branch of government, they are independent and they operate very much like a court system. So the process of change and engaging with the Commission is very different to how you might engage with a Member of Parliament or a Minister or something like that. So just wanted to raise that point. I like to take
Thank
every
you.
opportunity I can to make it clear.
Yeah, make a distinction
Commission's
for
a
it.
different animal and they like to think of themselves as a court, and the way you engage with them is almost as if they're a court.
A beast unto themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. Not answerable to the electorate.
No, okay.
Which is important. So sorry to go off on that divergence, but so to answer the question, which was really asked, is it reasonable? Well, we made almost that exact submission to the Commission back in December, as did a lot of employer groups in respect of their own individual industries. Do we think it's reasonable? I mean, I don't want to get myself in trouble. I kind of don't, but the reality is that's not what was driving the Commission's thinking. The Commission's thinking was level 1 was only ever supposed to be short term while you learn the absolute basics. It's not
like an induction into the business.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Like you get a sort of very general overview of what the business is. You get a little understanding of the crops and the way the business operates and the industry operates. It wasn't supposed to be, sort of long-term training arrangements. So you get across all aspects of the business. You're familiar with all aspects of the business, which I know is not really the question, but the point really is to focus on. It was only ever supposed to be temporary.
Yeah.
And the Commission. The reason they landed on 3 months within the Hort Award is because actually there was a 3 month. 3 months is already part of the award in terms of those formal training arrangements. So they thought, well, that's a pretty good signpost as to what those needs should be.
Yeah, gosh. Well, Ben Rogers, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for sharing all of your insights. And I suppose really the message to our viewers is forewarned is forearmed. And I'd like to say a big thank you very much to everybody who's joined us here today. And we're grateful that you take time out of your day to join us as well. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode at Fair Talk by Fair Farms. Thank you. Bye for now.